Hello, my name is Cynthia Hudson-Vitale, and I'm the head of Research Informatics and Publishing. And thank you all for joining us today. We have a variety of times represented here, so I'll hold back from saying good morning or good afternoon or good evening. But we are most appreciative you came to our Birds of a Feather on leveraging shared expertise for data curation and discovery. And today you'll hear from a panel of experts and others who have worked collaboratively to build community around shared expertise for data curation and data discovery. And I mean, we should also just point out that by its very nature, these networks are also seen throughout RDA. So what we're going to be describing here can be seen at like the macro level as well as sort of more locally, which should bring some interesting conversations in. Following the panel, there will be a time for discussion, and we're really excited to hear from you, those who are attending, about your own interest on building community and expertise and potentially networks for data curation and discovery. Next slide, please. So you all should, I believe in the chat, there is a link to the shared notes. So I would encourage you all to please visit that. At the bottom, you will have a link, or there is information about adding your name. So we can, oh, I don't have that right in front of me. So we can keep track of who's here and potentially follow up if there is interest. Yep, and thank you for sharing the link again. So these are all of the individuals who are involved and who you will hear from today. We will do introductions shortly as well. So it's a wide variety of institutions, organizations, and national and international work represented here. Next slide, please. So as I said, my name is Cynthia Hudson-Vitale. I'm just doing this brief introduction, and then I'm going to really serve as a facilitator for the rest of today. In addition, our hosts are Hannah Hadley and Erin Clary, who I'm going to turn over to introduce themselves and take it from here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Cynthia, and hello to everyone. And again, thank you for joining us. My name is Erin, and I'm the curation coordinator for Portage Network, which is an initiative of the Canadian Association of Research Libraries.
And hello, everyone. I'm Hannah Hadley. I serve as coordinator for DCN Education, the workshop, the IMLS workshops that we've had, and the data curation primers, resources for curators. I'm also the data curation education librarian at Pennsylvania State University. And next, I'm going to go over our agenda with you. We don't have a lot of time in this hour and a half, so it is going to go very quickly. We're going to start with two panels, and I'll introduce them in just a moment, and they'll be able to introduce themselves as well. Each panelist will have up to 3 minutes to introduce themselves and provide a brief introduction for their network project. And then we will ask them a broad question, and each panelist will have up to 5 minutes to respond to that broad question. After we have those two panels, then we will open it up to audience questions and discussion, which will be moderated by Erin. So you can begin, though, if you wanted to add questions or comments to our shared notes document, or during that time period, I had put to ask be unmuted, but I believe we're just going to have it where you can speak during that part. And then also we're going to be deciding on our outcomes for the final part of the session. So you can add suggestions to the shared notes document. We had come up with just 2 questions initially, but we don't have to stick with these. Do we want to establish an RDA interest group in the first place? And if so, a project that we thought of that might be useful would be to work on a directory of network projects like the ones that are presenting today. And perhaps you also have a project that you can talk about during the discussion session. Or if you have other ideas, please do share those. And I want to welcome all 6 of our panel members. The first panel is going to regard starting a community and establishing trust. And we'll have Lee Wilson speaking for Portage Network in Canada. And Nicole Contaxis will speak for the Data Discovery Collaboration Project, which is in the United States. And Wendy Koslowski will speak for DCN Education, which is a sub-project of the Data Curation Network. And then the second panel is going to be discussing barriers and opportunities for working together. And we'll have Marjan Grootveld, the Dutch National Coordination Point, which is part of the Dutch Data Curation Network, and Yasuyuki Miniyama, who is part of the Japan Consortium for Open Access Repository, and then also Lisa Johnston, who is the PI of the Data Curation Network. And I'm going to exit this and stop sharing. Oops. I have lost where stop sharing is. I'm so sorry. I'm having a little bit of difficulty here.
You can just leave it up if you want to. Maybe go back to the first panel and folks can introduce themselves.
Yeah, I
Well,
just made you a host. Can you see if you can take it down? It doesn't have a button for me to stop.
I cannot. So why don't we just go to slide 4, maybe?
Okay.
We can hang out there. Oh, you did it. Something
Right.
happened.
I think I was able to do it
that.
because we're hosts.
Good job, Lee.
Excellent. Okay, so the first panel, so the order will be Lee, Nicole, and then Wendy. And if you want to start off, Lee, with introducing yourself and your project.
Great, thanks, Hannah. Hi, everyone. My name is Lee Wilson. I'm the service manager for the Portage Network. Portage is, as Aaron said, an initiative of the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, or CARL, and it was launched in 2015. Portage is dedicated to the shared stewardship of research data in Canada through the development of a national research data culture, by fostering a community of practice for research data in Canada, and by building national research data services and infrastructure. We do this work primarily through our network of experts and also with infrastructure partners to provide training, tools, and services to the Canadian researcher community. The Portage network of experts is absolutely critical in developing resources, expert advice, and practical help to assist with the management of research data at every stage of the data lifecycle. And our groups include functional areas like data curation, planning, discovery, preservation, sensitive data, and data repositories. In addition, we have a research intelligence group, and this group is dedicated to increasing our understanding of the ecosystem sort of at large and its needs through things like surveys and environmental scanning exercises. Our experts primarily include academic librarians, but also data management professionals in a variety of institutes, institutional research officers, and members of government and non-governmental organizations. Since 2015, the network of experts has grown to include about 130 plus experts across 60 organizations. And during today's session, I will be speaking mainly to the work of our curation expert group and the outputs of a Canadian Data Curation Forum that was put on in October of 2019.
Thanks so much, Lee. And Nicole, if you would like to introduce yourself and your project.
Yeah, I'm Nicole Contaxis. I work at NYU Langone Health in the Health Sciences Library. I am the lead of data discovery at the library and for the NYU Data Catalog. The NYU Data Catalog is sort of the beginning point for our collaboration, so I can start there. We built a piece of open source software at NYU to help our researchers share and locate data regardless of where it's stored. As a health sciences library, we work a lot with restricted data, so we needed to make something that wasn't just a repository, but could handle the different procedures and policies in place meant to protect, patient and human subject data. So we made this software open source. We put it on GitHub. Slowly but surely, other institutions with funding from the National Network of the Libraries of Medicine started to implement this catalog at their own institutions. So our collaboration really started as 3 institutions on the phone together trying to figure out how to make things work. Since that point, about 3 years ago, we've really expanded. We got to the point where about 12 institutions had joined as the data catalog collaboration project. But then around this time last year, we decided to pivot and become the data discovery collaboration. And we dropped the project because we've decided we're permanent and we're not just here for a little bit. What that means is we've decided to look at a platform agnostic view of data discovery. Part of this move was made because there's a lot of other projects going on. So Montana State University in the United States has built a data discovery platform that's really quite interesting, while Cornell, their medical school, has built a data governance platform. And so all of these people have joined the data discovery collaboration, and now we're pursuing a platform agnostic way to improve data discovery at our institutions. This has meant over the past year, we've done a lot of governance work ourselves, trying to organize ourselves so that we collaborate better and more efficiently, and so that we can respect our own institutional differences, as some institutions are heavily resourced, others are not so heavily resourced. And so there's a lot of balancing going on as we build out a system that helps us talk to each other and work together better.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And Wendy, if you want to introduce yourself and your project.
Thanks, Hannah. Hi, I'm Wendy Koslowski. I am the data curation specialist at the Cornell University Library, and I also am coordinator of our research data management service group here at the university. So I'm going to talk to you today about, as Hannah already mentioned, a subgroup of the data curation network that focuses on education. So it is an IMLS funded project. It started in 2018 with 2 years of funding. We've gotten an extension for that for obvious reasons over the last 8 months. So the project really was an offshoot of the Data Curation Network, which you're going to hear more about in the next panel, with the goal of educating. Initially, our thought was academic librarians around what to do when you need to curate a data set. We have expanded that, and the program has held 3 workshops, 3 formal workshops under the IMLS grant. We've trained about over 90, we're going to broaden that term, 90 data experts, which has expanded beyond librarians to also museum curators, federal funding or federal agency employees, and government employees as well, around practices around data curation. They've also had these outputs that Hannah mentioned called the data curation primers, and these are resources for curators to help understand specifics around different types of data or formats of data. So the goal was to provide this kind of intermediate to advanced training around data curation and kind of upskill the resources that we already have existing in our organizations.
Thank you so much, Wendy. All right, well, we're going to go to the broad panel question, and each of you will have 5 minutes, and we'll go in the same order. So the question is, how did you, or what allowed you to start this community and establish trust within this community? And we'll start again with Lee.
Thanks. That's a really great question. So I think I should begin a little further back with the establishment of Portage and the Curation Expert Group in 2015. At this time, at least in Canada, data management really wasn't on most people's radar, and there was no community of practice to draw upon. There may have been a few institutions that had point N of a person thinking about data management, but largely there were no dedicated positions. Portage was established to bring together the people who were active in this space at that time. And it really started off as a series of smaller discussion groups called expert groups, which eventually grew into what we now call the network of experts. And I talked a little bit about that in the introduction. And as interest in research data management grew, we started getting more and more interest from our institutions, and we began moving away from just sort of high-level discussion towards more tangible outputs. Based on this need for actually moving towards tangible outputs, working groups started to be formed underneath expert groups, and these tended to be larger, a little bit more focused, a little bit more task-oriented, and also temporary. So they sort of had a project and they had a life cycle. And eventually we got to a point where we knew that the RDM community had grown in academic libraries across Canada. And we also knew that data management work was being done in repositories and research organizations across the domains. And likely this had been going on in some form or another, well before even Portage started. But there was obviously gaps in our understanding about who was doing this curation work, where it was being done, in what kinds of institutes, and also about the nature of the work itself. So what we call curation might be called data management, data wrangling, data cleanup by other groups. And really there was just a need to sort of understand what other groups were doing and develop a cross-sector vocabulary for that work. And it was really needing to better understand curation and the community of practice in Canada that was sort of growing informally and separately. That was a main driver for why we organized a data curation forum in October of 2019, so last year. And this forum brought together representatives from a range of institutions and organizations and had the goal of fostering a network, a national community of practice to catalyze the development and adoption of data curation standards, practices, tools, and skills across disciplines and institutions. And the forum was divided mainly into two sections. So one was focused around training, skill building workshops for data curation practitioners or anyone who's sort of interested in data curation and upskilling in that area, as well as a plenary session. And these were discussions that were intended to build a vision for a national approach to data curation in Canada. And what we wanted to do through this forum was to reach beyond the library sphere, which is a space that we in Portage had been working in and had some knowledge of, and connect with practitioners from these other sectors. So participants included researchers, data and information professionals, and administrators who represented a wide range of research institutes, NGOs, other research organizations, government, as well as funding agencies across Canada. And the objective of this forum was to develop a collective understanding of the role of data curation within the larger RDM and data stewardship landscape, but also to articulate the challenges facing the field, to identify resources that would support best practices in data curation, and to specify ways in which national coordination efforts might help to support local needs. So the main output of the forum is a report that summarizes these outcomes. It's available on Portage's Zenodo account. And it also articulates the perceived challenges and barriers to the curation work and outlines short, medium, and long range activities that we could undertake to address these challenges and inform a nationally coordinated approach to data curation. The main objectives that were identified by participants were around building capacity at the local and the national level, fostering this curation COP in Canada, communicating the value of curation to various stakeholders, including funders, developing and maintaining shared infrastructure to support these activities, and in terms of governance, creating an advisory group or other body to represent data curators and inform the development of governance at a national level. So the next step for us is to move forward on these objectives. So the Portage Curation Expert Group is evaluating the recommendations coming out of the report, seeking feedback and doing information gathering activities in an iterative process to ensure that there's buy-in from community members, as well as identifying partnerships with some of the other Portage expert groups in the other functional areas I talked about earlier, and planning to form new working groups where needed to move these objectives forward.
That's wonderful. You are a little bit over time.
Oh, am I? Okay.
But
Sure.
that was really great. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
Nicole, you are up now.
Great, thank you. And I hope none of you could hear me clicking my pen incessantly through this. So I apologize. I didn't realize I was off mute. Anyway, so as I said earlier, we started off as a collaboration based on this open source software. And really what spurred the beginning of this collaboration was the funding from the National Network of the Libraries of Medicine in the United States. Now, people not in the United States, you should just know that this is a network of medical libraries that helps provide funding to people and does a bunch of educational things. So they gave some money to institutions to implement this open source catalog, which was great because without that sort of funding, it's really hard for people to experiment and take chances. And so we're really grateful to the NNLM for giving us the opportunity to experiment like that. And what happened since then is we began to see that some of this experimentation was successful. So in those earlier years where it was really, when I say all of us would get on the call together, we would have phone calls with 30 some odd people on the phone, all of us trying to share ideas. And some of that worked really well. We had a basic science working group sort of form organically of people very interested in basic science data cataloging. And they did some great work in expanding our metadata for genomics related work. We also had people who were really interested in 3D model cataloging, which is something I haven't looked into myself, but people were really interested in it, and sort of this self-grown interest began to come together. What happened over time after, we formed, all of this is happening, it feels really good, is that we didn't have structure. So a couple of things happened. One, we would lose people's voices, and certain institutions really got highlighted because they were accustomed to speaking. Me, I could talk in just about any situation, so I will sit and take up space when maybe it's not the best thing for me to do. So we needed to start formalizing things so that we could create space for the people who do good work and have great ideas, but maybe aren't as comfortable, yelling on a call with 30 people as me and maybe the other New Yorkers feel like totally fine doing. So we've now gotten to this position where we really do need to develop trust between each other so that we can learn to say, for myself, hold back and wait a second so that other people who are slower to speak have the space to speak. And for those people to feel like they have something valuable to contribute and that they won't be judged or receive harsh criticism. So what we've been trying to do in order to generate that trust is to build a very, very clear structure. It's a bit weird for us as like a really homegrown institution and a really grassroots one. But what we were able to do is have a retreat with a bunch of people in person in February, which right now feels wild, but we did that. And we got together to start building up this governance. So in order to build trust between each other, we started to try to build alternate modes of communication. So not just these phone calls or now Zoom meetings, but rather written communication where people can place ideas in written documents and places to give people ways to communicate that might not be, because we don't all communicate the same, is what I mean. And since then, it's been working well to build up trust and increase communication across the whole network. It's also been very helpful as we've expanded. As I said earlier, we started with one piece of software. We are now platform agnostic. So we work with a bunch of other institutions that use different platforms. So this expansion in our governance really was timed well so that these folks can also share their ideas and not be overwhelmed by the amount of people just using the NYU Data Catalog open source software. So it's really come down to building spaces for alternate modes of communication and for building spaces for like alternate needs. And we've really benefited by bringing in these other platforms. And I hope eventually, we can get our software to talk to each other and really build out something that's very expansive. But for now, what we're doing is just learning from each other. So we now have Northwestern is now part of the collaboration. They've built out a lot of repository software. You know, the NYU Data Catalog is not a repository, but we have metadata experience. So we're starting to share across these lines, and it's going really well. And I think we're communicating well, and we're building trust so that we can share ideas that might feel a little out there at the start, but then we can build on them together and really generate something that's worthwhile.
Nicole, that was great. Thank you so much. Wendy, you're up.
Thanks, Hannah. I guess in a way, I want to build on a little bit of what Nicole mentioned about this idea of learning from one another. And I think that's really at the core of what the DCN education group is about. One thing I failed to mention in the introduction is that this group is a subset of the DCN, but it's 6 institutions, of which Cornell is just one of the ones participating. So I kind of broke this question out into 2 parts. And one is purely kind of the logistics of how this network got started and how that helped build this community and trust within the community. And that was that Cynthia and her group landed a scholarship through iAssist for a single workshop for us to kind of pilot this idea of whether or not there's interest, whether or not we can develop a curriculum that people find useful and is engaging. And we were able to test the whole concept of educating around data curation through this single workshop that we got external funding from. And basically we were able to then take that to IMLS and ask for the bigger project funds to do multiple workshops. So I think just kind of logistically that gave us not just the proof to the funders, but to prove to ourselves that there really was an interest and a need for educating around that. So I think that really helped. And then from the social side, I think this idea of teaching one another has been, at least within the DCN community, just core to this idea of trust. So we called it, and you've probably heard this phrase, of course, this peer-to-peer training model, where the instructors were actually curators from the institutions that were involved in those 6 institutions that I mentioned. And so we are actually doing the activities that we're teaching. We're not necessarily professors at our institutions, but we have hands-on experience and run into the same problems. And I think that the way the workshops were taught, and I see familiar faces on the session today of people who've been to the workshop, so maybe you can chime in about it, that it really was the opportunity to share experiences, and that while there are many activities involved, Lee, as you said, with curation or related to curation, that we can try to put the beginnings of a framework around that to help people understand. And that allowed, number one, a comfort level, I think, that was really important to build that community. And number two, the sense that these people who might have been coming from institutions where they were the only person there working on data or doing the particular job that they're doing, that they really aren't alone, that there are others out there that might be having the same problems or running into the same challenges. So in order to help build out that community, the DCN Education Group did a number of things. We already mentioned this idea of the primer. So one of the outputs of each of these workshops was that the participants broke down into groups and created these primers, but for each of those groups, they had mentors. And these were projects that expanded or extended up to a year after the end of the workshop that kept these people talking to one another and engaged with the activities that wasn't just the one-off workshop. And I think that that was really important to keeping that community strong. We also have built up a set of shared resources, so things that we learn during the workshops or we come across as activities during curators, that we have a place to put that information and can ping each other about working with them and how they do work, what shortcomings they have, that kind of thing. So I think those are the main points I have around community and trust building for the education group.
Thank you so much, Wendy. All right, we're going to go ahead and switch to the second panel. So the panel order is going to be Marjan, Yasuyuki, and then Lisa. And if you want to start us off, Marjan, with introducing yourself and your project.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, hello, everyone. My name is Marjan Grootveld. I work at Data Archiving and Network Services, or DANS, in the Netherlands. And one of the data services that we provide for researchers in the Netherlands is a long-term data repository, which of course explains why we're so interested in data curation as well. Before I say a few words about the Dutch Data Curation Network, let me introduce another Dutch network, the National Coordination Point Research Data Management. We call it LCRDM, and LCRDM is mainly a virtual network without that much funding, which brings together more than 200, well, self-acclaimed experts in all kinds of data-related jobs in research. And I use the term data-related because you're probably all aware of the hairy topic of job titles. We have data stewards, information professionals, policy officers, IT service providers, librarians, you name it. But all of us are in one way or another dealing with research data. And under the umbrella of LCRDM, we have task groups. They run for a short time, up to a couple of months, and each task group deals with a specific aspect of data management, sensitive data, fair data, sustainable software. And we were inspired by the US Data Curation Network, and that triggered us into 2019 to set up a task group on this topic to see if there was an interest in the Netherlands in a data curation network nationally, and also to see how feasible that would be. My colleague Lena Karvolskaya from the Free University of Amsterdam was also in the team. She's here in the session tonight, or with us it is tonight or today for you perhaps. And in this task group, focusing on a potential Dutch data curation network, we did basically two things. We used the curate or curated model of the US data curation network to start up with an inventory within our project team. 10 organizations in the Netherlands just used that checklist to take stock of what we are doing and what we're perhaps not doing so far. And the second thing we did was set up a survey among Dutch organizations that are involved, or we suspected to be involved in data curation. And I think that's enough of a cliffhanger for the introduction, and happy to say more about that later on.
Thank you, Marjan. And Yasuyuki, if you would please introduce yourself and your organization.
Okay, thank you, Hannah, and hello, everyone. Can I share my screen?
You should be able to. Let me know if you have problems with that.
Well, probably only me. I create the share screen. Can you see screen? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Nico. So, hello everyone. I'm Yasuyuki Minamiyama, data librarian of National Institute of Informatics, formerly the data curator of National Institute of Polar Research. I have only 3 minutes. So first, why we Japanese librarians need professional network. So very roughly speaking, it's too difficult to form curation teams in Japanese universities or research institutions because there is no or few subject library and data library in Japan due to our government's policy. So we think it's effective to define a best institution and establish a practical level network. It's inspired by data curation network. Yeah, thank you, Lisa. This slide shows the concept of Japan Data Curation Network. It's a temporary name, and our concept is still in infancy. But we focus in small and medium-sized universities because we would like to create a network that fits the characteristics of the Japanese community. So first case, use case-based institution and community case. Currently, I'm contacting the upper atmospheric research fields community named UGONet. So this network aggregates domain-specific metadata from small domain repository and distributes from the UGONet platform. So next slide shows the use case of using Gyro Cloud in SSH, the social sciences and humanities field. Now my coworkers try to create such a mechanism in social sciences and humanities domain. And the possible repository community in Japan. So luckily, already we have a big librarian community for operating institutional repository. 656 member institutions as of October 2020. So JP Core has a role of community building, and we have Gyro Cloud, cloud-based shared repository service. This repository software aims to support institutions that have difficulty in building and operating their own institutional repositories. So this is the last slide, collaborative method curation pilot in Ugonet network. When I worked at the National Institute of Polo Research, Ugonet data manager and I conducted a pilot about metadata curation as Ugonet curation team. Unfortunately, I have few time to explain this flowchart in detail, but by combining this network with the experience of this pilot, I hope to make the network a reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yasuyuki. And Lisa, if you want to go now, thank you.
Sure, thank you. Hi everybody. My name is Lisa Johnston. I work at the University of Minnesota, and I'm the principal investigator of the Data Curation Network project. We are now 12 partner institutions funded through 2 grants from the Sloan Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation here in the United States. Our project, the Data Curation Network, is trying to solve a shared problem that each of our 12 repositories have. And that is that we're all multidisciplinary data repositories. So we see a wide range of data types, different file formats. We work with researchers from all domains. And in order for us to really ensure that the data we are stewarding in our repositories is complete and have all of the necessary components and documentation so that others can reuse it, we really do need experts in a wide range of those topics and all of those topics to be able to curate the data as we're ingesting it. So we formed what Nancy McGovern calls a radical collaboration. And that means that we don't just share information with each other about how to curate data. We actually rely on each other to curate that data. We have a shared staffing model where the network provides a platform to match data sets of a particular type to curators who have that expertise. So we've been doing that. We actually opened up the network and turned it on in the January 1st of 2019. We have successfully matched almost 200 data sets across the network and across our institutions. And by doing so, we have not only solved that one major problem, but we've also explored a number of other topics together. As Wendy so elegantly put, all of our education work really established the trust and built a community. And it turns out that community is one of the primary services of the network. We also collaborate in other ways. We produce documentation. We have the curate steps, the check, understand, request from the researcher new changes, augment the record, transform the files. All of those curate steps go into our work that we do every day and to our training. We also formed a number of interest groups. We've got teams working on big data curation, on how to present the value proposition of curation to their institutions, and numerous other topics. So that is where I'll leave it there, and I look forward to talking about some of our barriers in a second.
Thank you so much. And now for the broad panel question, and each of you will have 5 minutes to respond. What are the barriers and opportunities to working together? And if you want to go ahead and start, Marianne.
Thank you again, Hannah. Barriers and opportunities, yeah. Well, first let me make a confession. In this birds of a feather session, I think our bird is more a conceptual bird. We don't yet have a data curation network in the Netherlands. So what I can share here comes mainly from the survey and from my project. But yes, we see some opportunities. And we learned them also from the survey we did with about 100 respondents. We're a small country, so that is quite a nice number. And we asked the colleagues, okay, what they would see as advantages or from such a kind of network. And it's all working towards training in a sense, because what was most popular or most promising was the idea that members of such a network can reuse guidelines, like how-to instruments or instructions, guidelines that the other organizations may already have drawn up. And as a second step, an advantage could be to collaborate on drafting such guidelines and defining basic good practices for data curation. So there was a clear sense of, yes, this could be advantages to all of us. So for the good side, barriers, of course, there were as well, and that started in our project team. Or maybe not so much a barrier as the need to agree on a common language. So we had some discussion about the definition of data curation we would use, at least in this project, and the scope, because we identified, because some of us came from institutional repositories, others come from institutional repositories, that depending on where the repository is positioned, in a sense, it may have another mission and another level of experience sometimes. So we decided to ignore for a moment data curation being carried out by researchers themselves and focus on data curation performed by repository staff and research support staff. And this kind of discussion helped us to start building this community on this topic, which was, of course, good. Challenges reported in the, or barriers reported in the survey were, for instance, what's in it for me, or I need a business model. Why should I occupy myself more with data curation than I already do? So certainly not all of our respondents assign a lot of priority to the activities related to data curation. Is it worth it? And will I be able to convince researchers that this is important and that we need something from them to build on that? So that was that feels like a kind of barrier that we need to address as a hopefully potential group. And another aspect of barriers and challenges is the difference in availability of clear procedures and workflows. So like I said, some of us are more dedicated. For others, it is one of the services that the university runs, and that corresponds roughly, we think, with the level of documentation of the processes around data curation. So that is the D of the curated model, the documentation of activities. If you're interested in more, I'll put the links to the report in the chat. But to end on a positive note, if I have a last minute, I still think that although we did not set the next step towards really starting this network, we do have the LCRDM network, we do have the collaboration, we do have a platform for sharing, and we also have good practices where, for instance, there is a collaboration between a university and a long-term data repository where the university's remit is to maintain and archive data for the short to mid-term, and then they hand over to a long-term repository, and that helps us already to define responsibilities, to learn to speak the same language and stuff like that. So there are good practices, and that makes me very hopeful.
Thank you so much, Marjan. And please do share that link. I'm sure everyone would appreciate that. Yasuyuki, you are next and you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you again, Hagana. So first one, barriers. And in the case of JP Core, so actually there are very few people who can directly participate in the discussions because they are non-English speaking area. So sometimes English barrier is higher than paywall for the librarian. Okay, it's a joke. And so anyway, geographic conditions are one of the barrier for me. However, for example, JPCore has been creating 3 educational RDM materials for general library staffs and Japanese researchers. Also, we have been cooperating with CORE, Confederation of Open Access Repository. For example, we provide input from the Japanese repository operation system on the requirements for good practice in data repositories. And also we are contributing to the multi-language version by translating this requirement into Japanese based on the local demands. So I think that it may be possible to work together on a specific topic, especially which has diverse demands from the research community. Okay, I'm finished. That's all.
Thank you so much, Yasuyuki. And Lisa, you have 5 minutes.
Sure. So the barriers and opportunities for the data curation network. This is a topic that we actually explore every year in our annual all hands meeting. I think everyone still likes doing that. I do. I appreciate it. I just want to go over kind of 3 major things that come to mind. And these aren't the typical things. I mean, I could go into a lot more detail about maybe the common elements that you could imagine for any work. You know, the defining your value proposition is hard, and creating a sustainable project is hard, and you know, all of that work. But I'm going to go into some other more interpersonal issues. So the first one is institutional priorities. So we are all representing different institutions, and each of our institutions are they're not shy about what they all want. They all want to be the best institution, and they all really have their own kind of priorities. And so as you're coming together to form a collaboration, you have to give up some of that privacy a little bit to share your success as a organization. And that is not always easy to do. And in some ways you could argue that it might be easier just for us to do it ourselves, and that way we won't have to get everybody to agree. So collaboration is slower. And the one thing I also want to point out about this, at least for the data world, is that each of our institutions is not a monolith. So we have 12 data repositories working together, but I guarantee, I know for a fact, each of these institutions has multiple different data repositories at it. So it's not as if all of Cornell is working with us. We're working with Wendy and the data repository that Wendy represents, where we know, since we did focus groups at each of our institutions early on, there are lots of different data repositories represented. And so that's something that you have to keep in mind, that it's this multifaceted organization that you're working with. The next, I think, is the unvoiced concerns. So we really recognize that we're a large group. Nicole mentioned this. When you've got 30 people on a call, not everybody is going to get to speak, and not everybody is going to feel comfortable speaking. So you do need to solicit feedback in a variety of ways. So what we do, as I mentioned, we do discuss this at our annual meetings, which do take place in person typically. But we also do surveys. We also do focus groups with each of our partners. And we ask them, how is it going? We talk to them about their concerns. This last year, we actually had a really successful process where we partnered 2 institutions together and had that conversation so that they could actually have a little back and forth about their different perspectives and needs. And again, kind of bringing up that peer-to-peer relationship. And then we do a satisfaction survey with all of our curators. We want to know that this work is something they enjoy. We don't want them to go, oh, not another data curation network assignment. And so we really want to make this something that they want to do. And one of the things we've heard, and Mara already mentioned this, they have other jobs. Curation is not 100% of anybody's job. And we've got 50 people in this network. And no single person is doing this all the time. So we really have to recognize that and balance that with what we expect from people and what we ask of people. And then finally, this one I think is really dear to my heart. We don't want to over-engineer our project. We don't want to provide so many different layers of governance and organization that it just feels heavy and burdensome. And that was, that would prevent barriers from people to join us. So we want to make sure that we stay really lightweight and we only put in as much governance that we need, and we try to be as transparent as possible so everyone can feel a part of the decision making. So we don't have to have layers and layers of governance, and we just need to continue to assess that and to listen to our users. So how opportunities? I just have one. How can we work together? How can our networks, our data networks work together and figure out what that landscape is of how we all fit in this landscape? There are enough problems to go around for all of us. And I think we have a lot of lessons learned that we can share with each other. So let's figure out how we can continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I want to again thank everyone from both panel 1 and panel 2, Lee Wilson, Nicole Kontaxis, Wendy Koslowski, Marianne Grutfeld, Yasuyuki Minamiyama, and Lisa Johnston. And then now I'm going to hand it over to Erin Clary, who's going to lead the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, do we want to start with Lisa's question that she ended there to the panelists about, an idea of how to sort of network our networks, or whether it makes sense to network our networks and bring in more networks and learn from each other and what's working and not?
Sounds great.
That makes sense. I'm happy to weigh in with just a thought I had based on Lisa's question. How can we all sort of work together as a network of networks? I think sharing resources is a big one. So I know that within our developing curation network here in Canada, we're still very new. We really like the curated model and that approach to data curation. One of our challenges is a language barrier or a consideration that we have 2 official languages in Canada, and everything that we produce needs to be available in both languages. And something like the curated model, where it has such a nice acronym, that can't always be directly translated over to French in our case. And so we've been in the process of taking the curated model and adapting it so that it can be dual language. But again, we wouldn't have been able to do that without first, having those as something, or that model as something that we could take and then build upon. And just to mention again, the primers, the curation primers that were brought up, these are such essential resources, and what we've been building around training and around knowledge bases for our own curators in Canada, because there is this now rich library of curation material and training materials out there, we don't need to go and reinvent the wheel and recreate all of these. We can create more just aggregation portals that pull in all of this rich material and make it easily available to our curators. So yeah, I think sharing resources is going to be really important.
I would just like to build on what Lee said, or where it's important to share resources, sort of as a way to not duplicate effort. I am not interested in redoing what somebody already did really, really well. And I know I've gone to one of the DCN workshops. I had a great time. I learned a lot. So I think, figuring out what each network's goals are, figuring out where our shared goals are, and figuring out where I don't need to make a goal because somebody perfectly capable and wonderful is already addressing that issue. I have found just within our specific network, knowing who's working on something means I can call somebody and be like, help me out with this. And then I sound a lot smarter just because I was able to reference the wonderful work that somebody else is doing. And so that's what I see as the most helpful thing, is reduce duplication of effort and just make us all look great because we're talking to each other. That's what I'd love to see.
Did anyone else want to chime in, or I can?
I had one more thought, Erin. Just thinking, Nicole, about what you said, combining the idea, Lee, of sharing our resources with one another. So things like the primers or our practices. But Nicole, I kind of heard what you said, not just about the resources, but also about the logistics. How do you build a sustainable project? How are you running your meeting so that everyone has a voice? Some of the very practical things that we in our individual networks are starting to learn by experience. Is there a way we can share those more intangible things that might be extremely valuable and yet help us look really good? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's an interesting idea. It's not like us to share, you know, our internal documents about how we thought about this one part of our meeting. How do we organize all hands meetings? Like, are we to the point where we want to share those kind of things, or is it too much? Would it not be useful because it would be overwhelming? Sorry, that was a question, not an answer, but
Have a lot of questions at this stage in the game. Actually, there was one question in the chat from a participant, Tanya, I believe, who asked which of the communication channels is the most fruitful, or do you find that they're all equal? And she gave some examples such as conference calls, surveys, focus groups, other ways of communicating.
I guess I'd say they are equal in the sense that each person is going to use one as their preference. So you kind of need them all. I would add Slack and IM and other communication channels there too. I think when you're dealing with a group of individuals across, you know, institutions, across nations, you're going to be dealing with a wide range of different communication cultures to begin with. And so you do have to set up multiple channels so that everybody can participate in the way that works for their workflow.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Tanya. Just to follow up, so who keeps track of all the channels? So there must be like one person who's trying to coordinate all of the responses. So is that perhaps your responsibility?
That is absolutely
somebody in charge.
It's a full-time job. I think you do have to build in a coordinator position to these kinds of projects, and you probably can't live without that person. I can't.
Right. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in one more time just to add to what Lisa said. Is we've had the most success in really focused conference calls. So sending out to the whole group information on what this meeting is going to be about, what we're going to be addressing, and then having a meeting where sometimes it only ends up being 3 people, but it's 3 people working on a very specific problem that want to share ideas. And generally, in my experience, that leads to very productive meetings, as long as they're very, very focused.
There's an audience member that was wanting to chime in, Nicholas Zimmer, if you wanted to unmute.
Hi, everyone. So I'm calling from Cape Town, University of Cape Town Digital Library Services. And thank you for letting me say a couple of words. First of all, just to thank you. And then just to contribute that sometimes I think part of the very practical stuff that is sometimes overlooked in these kinds of sort of general overviews is things around language, things around age gaps, things around digital gaps in digital capacity access, you know, the digital divide, etc., etc. I don't mean to, you know, sort of spew out lots of negative things. It's just that often it's a little thing like RDM sounds strange and it sounds foreign, it sounds European, it sounds like it's imported from the US and it's enforced and so on. This came up at another session yesterday. And it's just something that we find creates an enormous amount of friction. So before you even get to be in a room with people, you have to actually do an enormous amount of very imaginative and creative and sensitive work to actually connect with potential data stewards or curators and you have to really imagine and believe for years in advance that this will actually eventually happen. So I just wanted to share that. It's kind of the softer stuff, but it's really hard.
Thank you so much, Niklaus. That's a wonderful point that you brought up. And then I also wanted to let, is it Wolmar or Wolmar?
Volmar, yeah.
Please go ahead.
All right. So I was curious about this. I'm not Lisa, you mentioned that you pair data sets with professionals in some sense. And I'm wondering, like, how diverse is the level of curation effort inside of your network? And I mean, is there an issue with, or would there be a potential issue with kind of very expert level curation networks as compared to more kind of, well, less hands-on or less technical sorts of curation efforts?
That's a great question. And that's something that we definitely knew would be a challenge for us going into the project. So we set up a baseline, a minimum standard of curation that we trained all of our curators in. So as a baseline expectation, here are the things that you would do. You know, you check the files, you look at all the files, you see if there's any CREP files, etc. We understand, though, that because of the different file formats, there's going to be specialized actions that each person will take. And that's really kind of where the primers came in handy, because when you're dealing in, you know, a geospatial data set, you're going to be looking for different things than you would if you're looking at an Excel file. And so we do rely on the experts to take that additional deep dive depending on the file format. But yes, we do have to have kind of a standard, you know, at least do these following steps so that there is that level of consistency.
So maybe this is also related to a question that Matthew asked in the chat about what proportion of the work on curation involves bit preservation. I'm not sure. So this is, again, is a question, not an answer. But I'd be interested in that as well, because I can imagine that in some networks, indeed, the level of curation is more uniform than in other networks. I mean, in the Dutch context, so in our project team, it was clearly mixed. The bit preservation institutional repositories, roughly speaking, and a couple of the dedicated long-term repositories that go a bit beyond bit preservation, which are also more eager to get certified as being trustworthy and so on. So that might be good to collaborate because we offer different services, but it also might be a risk for communication and sharing because we do have these different missions and goals and also different resources for these ambitions.
Did anyone else want to unmute and ask a question?
I just had a thought building on, Volmar, your comment about levels of expertise, and it just got me thinking. So the data curation network is mostly academic plus still a generalist institutional repository, but would this concept of a network of experts add a disciplinary level work? And I don't have a lot of experience with it directly. I've never worked at an agency that just did its own, you know, I never, NASA, for instance, where it's not just some of the things that we do around metadata and documentation and making sure the files are clear, but it really gets into the standardization and how tightly linked the formats are to the repository platforms. themselves. It's an interesting idea to try to think of that kind of network functioning, but I really stumble on this idea of how you do that kind of training across the different platforms. We avoid that in a sense in the data curation network because we're all general repositories and pretty much format agnostic, but could a network of all the different places that take social science data and require DDI metadata form the same kind of network would be a really interesting idea. I don't know if that's what you were getting at, but it got me thinking about that.
Sorry. Yeah, so to reply, or it was kind of that thought I had. So I currently work at a node for the Elixir network, which is for life sciences and life sciences data, and I'm a data steward there. I'm new, so I'm not a life science data expert yet, but I'm going to be. And we're working with the kind of DNA sequencing data, which usually is deposited in specialist repositories. I mean, we're aiming to have all of our curators working with kind of the FAIR principles up to machine actionability, which means you need to know the terminology or find matching vocabularies that the data sets can be kind of translated into. So in those cases, and seeing, is it possible to kind of find machine actionability and the kind of the full FAIR principles by connecting networks across disciplines, or would this only work for generalist types of curation networks?
I think Tanya also answers this question too, by referencing the Society of Biocurators as one example where you are coming together around that topic. I think we've got a network here for geospatial data as well, where it's all of the curators coming together in a shared space for curating of that data type. Oh, great. Yes, thank you. So the link is there for biocuration. I think in that case, some of the structures that each of our groups have tried to define and have lessons learned about could be useful when we're talking about, how do you set up a network across your domain specialists, and what might you consider, what might you think about, what structures could you put in place to make that successful?
I think this extends to beyond curation. So we've had lots of conversations in our sort of budding network around how we can engage disciplinary data managers. We haven't solved that yet, but also even around data discovery. So we run a metadata aggregation platform as well, and we can work really well with generalist repositories, and we can work really well with disciplinary repositories that conform to how we think about data and data sets. But when you get into the really specialist repositories that have their data curated in such a fine way that's so purpose-built for their communities, we have a lot of trouble adapting our harvester so we can pull in those data sets and so that they're as easily discoverable as all the others. And so this is a problem that maybe starts with curation, but it extends to kind of all the shared aggregated kinds of services that we're trying to build.
We also just had a really good question that came in about inclusion, and I was just wondering from each of the panelists or also from any other groups that may be present, what are you doing or what would you like to do to help establish inclusion?
I will say I didn't do this thinking myself. We've had other people come in and help us figure out ways to make sure, Jennifer, in your question, you said, how do you make sure somebody's not talking too much? We've implemented rules in specific situations where if you've spoken, you have to wait until everybody else says something until you can speak again, which feels a little kindergartnery, but it really does help. And we've gotten a lot of this advice from a lot of admins. Our executive assistant is very good at figuring out ways to encourage people to talk and encourage people not to talk. But that's the first rule that we've gotten that's been really helpful in sort of managing oversharers.
Did anyone else have something to contribute to that, or we can ask another question?
I had a question just on the idea of inclusion that I want to aim specifically at the panelists who have newer projects or projects that haven't started yet. What can we do in communities that are more established that might help you?
That is a great offer. Let me think. So we already benefited from having a conversation with Cynthia and Lisa in the past. So yeah, we know you're very knowledgeable and also in a practical sense. What might help, apart from having this session, which is already a trigger in itself, if you would, in a sense, push information to us. And of course, I don't want to ask a lot of effort from you, but if you have outstanding practices or outstanding information or things that you know from your network, hey, this works, and you advertise it, and then I think I would like to get sometimes a push for this information if it's available. So for me, that would be one of the benefits of a network of networks, in a sense of sharing information. So that's more the written information perhaps than the intangible stuff, but as a way to start, yeah, I think that would be good as a trigger for us to know, okay, others have already tested it and found that it is useful. That would, I think, help us and speed up our process.
Thank you, Hannah. So it's a very interesting question, but it's a difficult question because already we have benefit from decision resources. So we should think to contribute to this community. So again, I think it may be possible to work together on a specific topic, especially geographic or multi-language level. Sorry, only my comment.
So a question I put on the chat a little while back is really of managing expectations in terms of the time length that the data is being curated. Has this question been dealt with it by different ways? Is it to do with the next funding period, or are you offering guarantees that's longer than that? There's always costs involved in keeping data for a long time. That's why I'm asking.
I can speak a little bit about timeframes, and your last comment though makes me want to clarify. At least for the data curation network project, we aren't a repository, so we don't hold the data. We just have a collaboration of the repository. So all the data stays with them, and all the costs of stewarding that data is still held with them. But regarding our expectations for timeframes, that's really key for us. Each of the data sets that we curate, there is a researcher waiting for the end result oftentimes, because we're curating, at that point of ingest. There's of course many things that happen down the road in terms of preservation and stewardship, but for our piece of it, when we're getting that expert to review the package, there's always a expectation. So we do have time limits. The submitting institution places a deadline on when they need that the recommendations from our curator expert for that particular data set. And it usually is about 5 days. 5 business days is our typical standard for us, at least.
It's interesting, Lisa, because my understanding is that curation is very much of an active process which goes on. So you may move to one new standard, but in a few years' time, nobody's using that standard anymore. So you need to re-examine what new standards you need to move the data to. So it's not just a one-off thing, it's something that needs to continue.
100% agree with that. Absolutely. And I think that that is an issue that we need to deal with on how to provide updates and an additional recommendation on how the repository can best format that data going forward, because you're absolutely right. It's not a one-time and you're done situation. But I think that that does make our job, you know, once we've figured out this baseline first, I think we could really explore expanding our workflows to include sort of the additional updating and upkeep for the data. Thank you.
And that could be, or something that a network of networks also sees as one of the topics to share information about, because this is a kind of technology watch where it would be pointless for each repository to do them by themselves. So this is typically a community development.
Yeah, just to build on this a little bit, you know, hearing active data curation, it seems, at least what we've been thinking about in Canada and where you're at with the data curation network, it's sort of at the publication point of the life cycle that we're largely able to intervene and to support researchers as they publish data sets. But we also know that active data curation is a thing, and there are data managers embedded within research groups. And in some ways, all of our collective jobs would be made easier if there was more curation work being done along the active phase of the research. So, you know, just thinking about how we can support these kinds of activities as well might be useful.
We had one more question in the chat about radical collaboration, and just wondering if you could give a quick overview of how that works, or what steps are taken or resources are needed to sort of implement a project that is following that model.
I think the link to some slides that Nancy McGovern had presented at IDCC in Melbourne a couple of years ago is in the chat. I guess I could just expand on a little bit that, you know, radical collaboration, from my understanding of it, is where you are really relying on another group to help you provide to help you achieve your mission. Some of the resources that we've taken to achieve that in the data curation network have been MOUs, or you know, memorandum of understanding, or you know, institutional agreements between the partners that each member is contributing a certain percentage of time to the project, so that we know that we can rely on them for doing some of the work that comes through, and providing, you know, dedicated staffing time. So that's really helped us establish just an understanding of how the collaboration should function. And I should mention one other key element has been our code of conduct. And that is another sort of formalized document that establishes how we want everyone to feel treated well and respected in the project and the network. And it just established a really nice baseline of understanding. So when we onboard new members, we can share that with them. So those are some of the things we've tried to do to implement radical collaboration in DCN.
Lisa, I have a quick question for you as a person who's considering making a code of conduct. How did you go about that as a network?
We built on the code of conducts that we liked from other groups. We pulled from either code from lib. There's 2 references in our code of conduct, and we just mercilessly pulled word for word from theirs, and then edited it and adapted it. And actually, we're going through a review process right now to add additional values to the code of conduct to really represent who we are, not only to articulate for ourselves, but also to help us determine who to partner with. We want to be able to partner with groups that share our values, and we need to articulate those first.
And on that note of partnership, I'm sorry, if anyone has any additional questions, please put them in the notes. And if you put your contact information in there, any questions that were unanswered by the panel, I'm going to get answers for you, and we will send that out in an email, but we do need you to sign the guest book in order for that to happen. And also, we do need to decide on our outcomes here. We just have a couple minutes left. We might want to decide if we want to continue as an RDA interest group, or if we want to continue perhaps in some other means. But it sounds like from everyone that's spoken today that it would be useful to be able to stay in touch and to be able to share information.
Yeah, I heard that as well. And when you just put something in the chat that, you know, it seems like a lot of our conversation has been around these logistical kind of infrastructure level questions, like how things are actually operationalized, how it works, the documentation around that. And I don't know how, like, it could just be maybe even a working group. Somebody had mentioned previously that the data stewardship interest group is working on some of these things well. So maybe we could reach out to them as kind of a next step and see if more precisely what they are doing to ensure there's no overlap. But it may be also an opportunity to spin off a working group from that to share some of this documentation potentially. Other thoughts are welcome though.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I put that comment in because that's the group I'm in, and I can sense in the conversation it's just it does seg, if that's the right word, it does mesh very well. You know, there are 8 subgroups or task teams in the interest group, professionalizing data stewardship. And very briefly, they're about a business case for data stewardship. They're about terminology. They're about integration of data stewardship across an organization, about job profiles, about training and career tracks and networking and knowledge exchange, and also certification. So I think most of those topics actually arose here. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity.
Sarah, do you want to share what you're putting a lot in chat about?
I can do, yeah. So I'm just cooking my dinner at the moment. That's why I have my video off. So yeah, I mean, I think it could work as an interest group and just continue, because you can have outputs from interest groups. And it sounds like what you're trying to do is pull together like the various lessons learned and just have that ongoing discussion, which I think sits quite well with like a regular ongoing group. If you find that you know, there's a lot of overlap with the data steward group and there are some concrete outputs and maybe a working group, but I think the existing discussion and the way it's going sits quite well with an interest group for RDA structures.
I think I would also try to maybe move away from some of our content, you know, data curation and data cataloging and even data stewardship, and focus deeply on these issues of how to build and grow a network. And actually, I would really love to hear, and maybe Sarah, that's what you were representing today, the RDA perspective of, you know, being probably the best example of a network that brings us together. And, you know, how do we achieve some of these examples and kind of elevate above, you know, what we're actually kind of heads down working on in our day-to-day, but elevate it to kind of the how do you grow and successfully navigate this space where it's just constantly evolving and changing.
Yeah, from an RDA perspective, I think a lot of the things you've discussed today resonated, you know, so having codes of conduct, making the conversation inclusive and open to everybody. I really liked, I know, Nicole, you'd said it sounded a bit kindergarten, but I really like that idea of not letting certain voices continue to speak. And it can seem really, you know, cruel and silly, but actually sometimes people just need longer to formulate their thoughts, or they want a different mode of contributing that thought. They might not want to have video on or speak out. And I think unless you really take a lot of steps to try and broaden that discussion, you don't get the best of everybody. So I think sometimes you have to be really quite dogmatic in the way you organize and run things. But yeah, I mean, from RDA, I think it's just a case of trying to have your core values, making sure people uphold those, that they actually do really believe in inclusivity, that they are open and transparent, that it's not just a platform for somebody, you know, you're actually trying to make it a creative space. So it aligns with a lot of the things that have come out of Nancy's radical collaboration work as well. I think you have to be open to bringing all the different stakeholders to the table and trying to get that richer discussion, and be open to hearing things that might not be your own opinion, and being willing to change and reflect on that. Jennifer, you might be speaking.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Sarah. That was so beautifully shared. I just want to add to that I think when the 3 or so voices start dominating discussions, then they tend to, it tells the group that these are the 3 authorities in the group. And I don't think that that's what we want when we're building our communities and networks. We want it to feel like all the voices matter. And when we let 3 voices dominate, we don't do that.
Excellent. So I think if we just wrap up, you have 1 minute left. Is that right, all? So what we'll do is, for those of you, if you haven't already, please go ahead and put your contact information in the Google Doc. What we'll do is we'll put together a doodle poll and maybe get together in the next month or so, start thinking about this interest group, and then also touch base with the stewardship interest group, and kind of go from there. So thank you all for your time. Thank you to our panelists as well for sharing your experiences about developing networks, and everyone who participated today. It was a really great conversation. Hope you have a lovely day, evening.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
As well. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.